There's a tank that changed everything, not because it was the most powerful, not because it was the fastest, not because it had the thickest armor or the biggest gun, but because it showed up everywhere, could be built by the thousands, survived conditions that would kill anything else, and fundamentally rewrote the rules of armored warfare. This is the story of the T-34, the tank that won World War II and became the most important armored vehicle ever built. When German forces launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, they expected to crush the Soviet Union in weeks. The Wehrmacht had steamrolled through Poland, France, and the Low Countries with a combination of superior tactics, coordination, and technology. German tank commanders were confident. They had Panzer III's and Panzer IV's well-trained crews and proven doctrine. They thought they knew what Soviet armor looked like: obsolete, poorly designed, crewed by undertrained soldiers. They were about to get the shock of their lives. The first encounters with the T-34 were nothing short of terrifying for German forces. Imagine you're a German tank commander in the summer of 1941. You've been rolling through Soviet positions, your 37mm and 50mm guns punching through Soviet BT tanks and T-26 like paper. Then suddenly, this low angular beast appears from the tree line. You give the order to fire. Your gunner puts a round right into its hull. The shell bounces off. You fire again. Another ricochet. The T-34 rotates its turret toward you, and you realize you're in serious trouble. This wasn't supposed to happen. German doctrine was built on the idea of technological and tactical superiority. But here was a Soviet tank that could shrug off their standard anti-tank weapons, move faster than their medium tanks, and mount a gun that could tear through German armor at ranges where German guns were useless. Field reports started flooding back to German high command. Generals who had dismissed Soviet industrial capability were suddenly demanding answers. How did the Soviets build this? How many do they have? And most importantly, how do we stop them? The T-34 didn't come out of nowhere. It was the product of hard lessons learned in the Spanish Civil War and the border conflicts with Japan at Khalkhin Gol in 1939. Soviet tank designers led by Mikhail Koshkin had studied what worked and what didn't. They looked at the BT series of fast cavalry tanks with their Christie suspension. They examined the heavier T-28 and T-35 multi-turret tanks that looked impressive but were mechanical nightmares. They analyzed combat reports from Spain where Soviet T-26s faced German and Italian tanks, and they realized something crucial. The future of tank warfare wasn't about having the biggest gun or the thickest armor. It was about balance. Koshkin's design philosophy was ruthlessly practical. The T-34 needed to be fast enough to exploit breakthroughs, tough enough to survive enemy fire, powerful enough to kill enemy tanks, and simple enough to be produced in massive numbers by a workforce that included women, teenagers, and workers with minimal training. Every design choice reflected this. The sloped armor wasn't just for looks. At 45 degrees, the frontal armor was effectively much thicker than its actual 45mm. A shell hitting at an angle has to pass through more material, and there's a good chance it'll just bounce off entirely. German tanks of 1941 had vertical armor, which meant every millimeter of thickness was all you got. The T-34's geometry was its secret weapon. The suspension was brilliant in its simplicity. The Christie suspension, inherited from the BT series, used large road wheels and long coil springs. This gave the T-34 excellent cross-country performance. But the real genius was in the tracks. Wide tracks, 500 millimeters across, distributed the tank's weight over a larger area. Ground pressure was low. This meant the T-34 could go places where German tanks with narrow tracks would sink into the mud or get bogged down in snow. When the autumn rains turned Ukrainian roads into bottomless mud in 1941, German tanks were stuck. T-34s kept moving. When winter came and temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius, German tanks wouldn't start. Their engines seized. Their optics fogged. Their crews froze. The T-34's diesel engine turned over and it kept fighting. Let's talk about that diesel engine because it's another example of the T-34's practical genius. Most tanks of the era used gasoline engines. Gasoline is highly flammable. A single armor-piercing round penetrating the engine compartment could turn your tank into a crematorium. The T-34 used a V2 diesel engine. a 12-cylinder power plant derived from an aircraft engine. Diesel is much less flammable than gasoline. It's also more fuel efficient, which means longer range. The V2 produced 500 horsepower, giving the 26-ton T-34 a power-to-weight ratio that made it one of the fastest medium tanks in the world. Top speed on roads was 53 kilometers per hour. Cross-country, it could maintain speeds that left German tanks eating dust. The 76.2 millimeter F-34 gun was another masterstroke. It wasn't the biggest gun on the battlefield in 1941, but it was big enough. It could penetrate any German tank at combat ranges. The long barrel gave it good velocity and accuracy. And because it was a standard Soviet caliber, ammunition was plentiful. The Germans, by contrast, were using multiple gun types across their tank fleet, which created logistics nightmares. The T-34 kept it simple. One gun, one type of ammo. Easy to supply. But here's where the T-34 really separated itself from the competition: production. Building a tank is one thing. Building thousands of tanks while your country is being invaded is something else entirely. The Soviet Union in 1941 was facing an existential threat. German armies were closing in on Moscow. Entire industrial regions were about to be overrun, so the Soviets did something extraordinary. They moved their factories. Between July and November 1941, the Soviets relocated more than 1,500 industrial enterprises from the Western Soviet Union to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. We're talking about entire tank factories being disassembled, loaded onto trains, and shipped thousands of kilometers east, then reassembled and put back into production in a matter of weeks. The main T-34 production facilities ended up in places like Nizhny Tagil, Chelyabinsk, and Omsk, far beyond the reach of German bombers. Workers lived in brutal conditions, often sleeping in unheated barracks or even in the factory buildings themselves. They worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer. Many were women and teenagers because the men were at the front, and they built T-34s at a pace that defied belief. By the end of 1941, Soviet factories had produced over 3,000 T-34s. In 1942, they built more than 12,000. By the end of the war, total T-34 production exceeded 84,000 units. No other tank in history has been produced in such numbers. The Germans, for comparison, built about 6,000 Panther tanks, their answer to the T-34, and around 2,300 Tigers. The Soviets were outbuilding them 10 to 1 or more. This wasn't just industrial capacity. This was total war, where every resource, every worker, every factory was mobilized for a single purpose: survival. The T-34's design made this mass production possible. It had fewer parts than comparable German tanks. It used welded construction instead of more time-consuming methods. The turret was cast in one piece, which was faster than assembling it from plates. The tracks were manganese steel, hard-wearing, and easy to replace. If a T-34 threw a track in the field, the crew could fix it with basic tools and get moving again in under an hour. German tanks often required specialized equipment and trained mechanics. The T-34 was built to be maintained by conscripts with minimal training. There's a darker side to this simplicity. Early T-34s were not comfortable or user-friendly. The interior was cramped. The driver's hatch opened sideways, which meant you couldn't bail out quickly. Visibility was poor. The tank commander had to unbutton and stick his head out to see anything, which was a great way to get shot by a sniper. The transmission was bulky and required serious muscle to shift gears. Crews joked that you needed a sledgehammer to operate the gearbox, and they weren't entirely kidding. The two-man turret meant the commander had to load the gun, command the crew, and watch for threats all at the same time. This was a serious tactical disadvantage compared to German tanks with three-man turrets and dedicated loaders. But here's the thing, none of that mattered as much as showing up. The T-34 wasn't designed to be the best tank in a one-on-one fight. It was designed to be good enough, in sufficient numbers, to overwhelm the enemy. When you've got 10 T-34s for every German Panther, you can afford to trade losses. When your tank can be repaired in the field with basic tools and your enemy's tank needs to be shipped back to Germany for a new transmission, you win the war of attrition. The T-34's philosophy was Soviet doctrine in metal form. Quantity has a quality all its own. Let's talk about sloped armor again, because this innovation alone changed tank design forever. Before the T-34, most tanks had vertical or near-vertical armor. This was simple to manufacture and easy to design, but it was inefficient. When you slope armor, you increase the effective thickness without adding weight. A 45mm plate at 60 degrees from vertical presents 90 millimeters of effective thickness to an incoming shell. The T-34's front armor was sloped at 60 degrees. Its side armor was sloped at 40 degrees. This meant German 37mm and early 50mm guns were nearly useless against it at normal combat ranges. Shells would hit, ricochet off into the sky, and German tank crews would have to watch in horror as the T-34 rotated its turret and returned fire. After the war, every major tank design incorporated sloped armor. The American M26 Pershing, the British Centurion, and especially the German Panther all showed clear T-34 influence. The Panther, which appeared in 1943, was basically Germany's attempt to build their own T-34. It had sloped frontal armor, a powerful gun, good mobility, and decent protection. But it was over-engineered, expensive, and mechanically unreliable. The Panther was a better tank than the T-34 in almost every technical aspect, but it couldn't be produced in enough numbers to matter. By the time Panthers were rolling off the production line in Nuremberg, there were tens of thousands of T-34s prowling the Eastern Front. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 was the T-34's defining moment. Kursk was the largest tank battle in history. The Germans had concentrated their best forces, including new Tiger and Panther tanks, for one massive offensive to cut off a Soviet salient and regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. The Soviets knew the attack was coming. They prepared defensive lines with minefields, anti-tank guns, and dug-in infantry. And they massed T-34s in huge armored reserves, ready to counterattack once the German offensive exhausted itself. The battle was carnage. German tanks advanced into carefully prepared kill zones. Soviet anti-tank guns, including the fearsome 76.2mm divisional guns, knocked out Tigers and Panthers at long range. When German armor broke through the first defensive lines, they ran into waves of T-34s. The T-34's mobility allowed Soviet commanders to rapidly shift forces to threatened sectors. The wide tracks meant T-34s could maneuver across the churned-up, cratered battlefield while German tanks struggled. And when German tanks took damage, they often had to be abandoned because recovery vehicles couldn't reach them or parts weren't available. T-34s that were damaged could be towed back, repaired overnight, and sent back into battle the next day. Kursk broke the back of the German armored force on the Eastern Front. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht was in permanent retreat. And everywhere they went, there were T-34s. Urban combat in Stalingrad, where T-34s brawled with German tanks in the rubble. The vast open steppes of Ukraine, where T-34 formations maneuvered like cavalry. The forests of Belorussia, where T-34s supported infantry in brutal close-quarters fighting. The final assault on Berlin, where columns of T-34s smashed through the last German defenses. The T-34 evolved during the war. The T-34-85, introduced in 1944, addressed some of the original's shortcomings. It had a larger three-man turret, which meant the commander could actually command instead of loading the gun. The 85mm gun was more powerful, capable of engaging German heavy tanks at reasonable ranges. Visibility improved with better optics and a commander's cupola. Production simplified further. By 1944, a T-34-85 could be assembled in about half the man-hours of a T-34-76 in 1941. The Soviets were getting better at building tanks just as the Germans were running out of fuel, trained crews, and industrial capacity. After World War II, the T-34 didn't retire. It went global. Soviet allies and client states received thousands of T-34s. The tank saw action in the Korean War, where it proved effective against early American tanks and caused the U.S. to accelerate development of the M46 and M47. T-34s fought in the Middle East, in Arab-Israeli wars, often facing off against Western-supplied tanks. They appeared in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. Wherever there was a conflict and Soviet influence, there were T-34s. Some are still in service today, more than 80 years after the design first appeared, used by paramilitary groups and poorly funded armies. No other tank can claim that longevity. The T-34's legacy isn't just about numbers or battles won. It's about changing the entire paradigm of tank design, Before the T-34, tanks were specialist vehicles, expensive and complex. After the T-34, the standard became simplicity, reliability, and mass production. The Soviet Union went on to produce the T-54 and T-55, which applied the T-34's lessons to create the most widely produced tank of the Cold War, with over 100,000 built. The T-72, T-80, and T-90 all trace their lineage back to the T-34's design philosophy. Even Western tanks, which pursued different paths with more crew comfort and technological sophistication, acknowledged the fundamental truth the T-34 proved. Armor, mobility, and firepower must be balanced, and a good tank that can be built in quantity will beat a great tank that can't. The T-34 won because it was the right tank at the right time. It had the armor to survive, the gun to kill, the mobility to maneuver, and the simplicity to be mass-produced under the worst possible conditions. It was crewed by people who knew. Their lives and their country depended on it. It was maintained by factory workers who labored in unheated buildings through Siberian winters. It was designed by engineers who understood that perfection is the enemy of good enough. And it fought in the largest, most brutal conflict in human history, from the gates of Moscow to the rubble of Berlin. The Germans built better individual tanks. The Tiger and Panther were more powerful, better protected, more comfortable for their crews. But they were complex, expensive, and broke down constantly. They required trained mechanics, specialized parts, and time to repair. The T-34 could be fixed with a hammer and some wire. The Germans could win tank versus tank engagements, but they couldn't win the war because the Soviets could replace losses faster than the Germans could inflict them. Every destroyed T-34 was replaced by 2 more. Every lost crew was replaced by new conscripts who learned on the job. It was brutal, it was costly in human lives, but it worked. This is the lesson of the T-34. War isn't won by having the best technology. It's won by having enough technology used effectively, applied relentlessly. The T-34 was never the best tank on the battlefield, but it was always there, in numbers that couldn't be matched, with logistics that couldn't be broken, operated by a nation that refused to surrender. It was the tank that turned the tide on the Eastern Front. It was the tank that rolled into Berlin. And it remains to this day the most important tank ever built. Not because it was perfect, but because it was perfectly suited to the war it had to fight. The T-34 didn't win by being a super tank. It won by showing up everywhere, all the time, until the battlefield belonged to the Soviet Union. Thank you for watching until the end. You can click in these other videos if you like this one. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and click the bell icon to be notified when we upload a new video. Have a good day.